Welcome back all, Dr. JC here, part 2 of lecture 10. In part 2 here, we're going to take a look at some select battles associated with the Great War, World War I. We're going to focus more specifically on the Western Front. We're going to talk briefly about the Battle of the Marne, Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, and then end up with the German Kaiser's spring offensive in 1918, known as Operation Michael or this Kaiserschlacht. And we will save for part 3 the Allied counteroffensive, which is the famed 100 days in 1918 that will bring an end to the war. We'll save that discussion for part 3 when we talk about American involvement in World War I. Now, prior to discussing the first major battle of the war, or the German war planning that was behind it, I think it's important to note that in 1914, most all soldiers that go off to fight are imbued with a sense of mission and purpose. They are. They recognize that this war is likely going to be fast, over soon. After all, had not those so-styled wars of German unification been very fast? The Second Schleswig War, where Prussia and Austria defeat Denmark. The Austro-Prussian War, 7 weeks. The Franco-Prussian War, 6-7 months. So in 1914 and 1915, youngsters are ready to go off to fight, to go quote-unquote see the elephant. And the surviving diaries and letters and poetry collectively paint a pretty important and interesting picture into the collective mindset and psyche of the men that fought in the trenches. And as it relates to poetry, I've done a good bit of research in World War I here myself as it relates to poetry. And you might be interested to know that in the years of 1914 and 1915, nearly 15,000 poems were crafted every single day by soldiers. That's about 5.5 million poems, just poems, a year in the first 2 years. Yet by 1916, and when we get to the Somme and Verdun, the tenor, focus, and writing of these poems changes. There's a psychological turn and maybe an ideological turn that takes place. That after 2 years of war, after the bloody battles that are Verdun and the Somme, a new reality, a brutal one, emerges for soldiers in the trenches. That they're no longer individual soldiers out there for cause and country. Rather, they're just faceless entities, part of faceless armies, bent on little more, it seems, than mobilization and mutual annihilation. And it wasn't just the individual that didn't seem to matter, it was nature too. Nature itself seemed to be swallowed by steel. So when we get to 19 and 16, understand entire towns are going to be eviscerated. Guillemont along the Somme, one such example. And there's an individual by the German soldier by the name of Ernst Junger who's written a work called The Storm of Steel. You guys may know something about it, may have read it. But I think Ernst Junger in 1916 captures this psychological turn that takes place. That this isn't fun anymore. And he writes, quote, "Chivalry here took a final farewell. It had to yield to the heightened sense of war, just as all fine and personal feeling has to yield when machinery gets the upper hand. This is an industrial war, and just as fast as machinery can be mass-produced, killing can be mass-produced as well." So the depth of, in some sense, despair one can read in these letters and poems in the latter years of the war. Understand that is a personal sort of feeling that's going to be carried into the period after the war as well. So in part 3, when we talk about this Treaty of Versailles, the treaty that's going to end the war specifically with Germany, I want you to keep in mind the despair that these soldiers have. Because in some ways it really wasn't despair at their own leadership, at their own country. It was despair or darkness caused by others. And that's an important reality to those folks. So we'll talk about that more as we move ahead, especially in part 3 next. But I wanted to kind of lay that groundwork here, that there's this initial rush to war, drums and trumpets, flags waving, but by the time we get to 1916, that all turns. And thus, once the war ends, there's a lot of healing that needs to go on, and we'll discuss whether or not treaties signed, such as the one at Versailles, were really focused on healing. With that aside, let's focus now on the first major battle of World War I, and to me, my interpretation, the most important of battles, the First Battle of the Marne. Now, I refer to the First Battle of the Marne here. Very brief battle, 7 days, takes place in September, first year of the war, 1914, as the most important, largely because most all German planning was predicated on a single front war, and thus German strategy called for a quick movement into France, knock the Frenchies out of the war, then you can go ahead and shift men and material east, deal with the Russians, and if need be, we negotiate with the English. Simple. And perhaps it would have been that simple. We don't know. But one thing that did take place is that German war planners, von Schlieffen and von Moltke, they wanted to hold nothing back when they attacked, one way or the other. And their one way, first way, was against the French. We go in with everything. We finish them off, and then we head east. The problem for German war planners, however, was the Emperor. Emperor Wilhelm II, yes, the same individual that fired Bismarck, same individual that let that reinsurance treaty lapse. He was not in favor of the plan. He didn't like the idea of his Eastern Front, that border with Russia, being largely exposed. And as a result, he ordered that several German divisions be held in the East, just in case they were needed. Tragic mistake for the Germans, largely because, as you can see on the map here, the Marne River is east of Paris. If the Germans had extra divisions, they could have flanked that line, swept around that line, and very likely captured Paris. But being asked to go in with 70% of your attacking force, what one German officer called going in to fight with one boot off, they had to narrow their attacking front rather than widen it. And that enabled the Allies, the French and the British, to set up a defensive position along the Marne River and actually counterattack. Paris will not fall, France will not capitulate, and the Germans' worst nightmare is facing them, a two-front war. And that's why, for me, the First Battle of the Marne, the first major battle of the war, is the most important battle. Because the Germans' inability to take Paris, to knock France out of the war, led to this much longer fight on two fronts, and quite frankly, almost a war of attrition. Now, before fast-forwarding a couple years to two other major, much longer-lasting battles, and much bloodier ones, I would like to call attention to the battlefield casualties here at the Marne. Over 500,000 men in 7 days. Weigh that to the American Civil War. 4 years, 750,000 American lives. That's 4 years. This is over 500,000 in 7 days. What seemed to be mind-boggling losses. The Marne's going to be a baby compared to what we see in 1916 and 1917. By 1916, the battlefield lines roughly ran along the red lines being shown here. And you'll notice in a way that Verdun is kind of a pivot point. And beginning in February of 1916, the Germans decide that we are going to obliterate the fortress that is Verdun. We are going to bleed the French that are there white. We'll kill them all. And thus begins a several-month battle known as Verdun. And the artillery that was spent here was almost unthinkable over these several months. Estimated 32 million shells. That's 1,500 shells for every square meter of a battlefield. Think about that for a minute. If you were in the college classroom, a physical classroom, that's like 3,000 shells landing right inside that classroom. So even if you weren't hit by one of those shells, imagine what that's going to do to you mentally. Shell shock, they'll call it. Today we call it post-traumatic stress. And you'll notice the casualty counts at the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. We don't really know how many French and German forces were lost, because quite literally people were eviscerated. And this image here gives us a depiction of what the battlefield, the preserved part of the battlefield today, looks like 100 years later. 100 years of time and erosion, and you still see this. So it should give us little wonder why the tenor and tone of the poems changed by the time we got to 19 and 16. Oh, and by the way, this was just Verdun. We're not even talking about the Somme. And by the summer, once it looked like Verdun was getting ready to crack, the Allies decided to launch an all-out attack themselves along the Somme River to try to relieve the fortress of Verdun and the French at Verdun. And starting in July, the Allies, British, French, and others, will pour over the top and into no man's land. And by November, after the loss of about 630,000 men, they will have gained 6 miles. Yes, 100,000 lives per mile. Who's ready to join and fight now? Hell, I don't even know I want to play a video game with that high of a casualty count. Crazy. By the end of 1916, the Battle of Somme will end in November, Verdun in December. Two things will become clear. First, Germany's in trouble. They're running out of men. Most of their officers and peacetime trained army is gone now, wounded, killed, captured. And number two, that the Allies, while they still put pressure on the United States to try to get them to come into the fight, they recognize that the new strategy is a simple one. Just as the Germans were going to bleed us white at Verdun, we now are going to bleed them white. We have more men than they do. It's a mathematical equation. Therefore, in 1917, we will continue to attack until they have no more men. Thus begins this bite and hold strategy of the British and the Allies in 1917, as shown here on this slide of Passchendaele, the campaign of Passchendaele. Yet there's a couple problems associated with this strategy. First, it doesn't really do a whole hell of a lot to improve the morale of your own men. Blowing a whistle, asking them to go over the top and get blown up for a few hundred yards of real estate. And number two, there's going to be a couple changes that take place in 1917. Yes, the United States, as we'll see, is getting ready to enter the war. But there's also a Russian Revolution that's going to take place, led by Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin. We'll talk about that in weeks ahead. And when this Russian Revolution takes hold, and when Lenin comes to power, he will negotiate peace with Germany, which means all those German troops that were on the Eastern Front, guess where they can come now? Yep, west. So German strategic thinking is going to change by the time we get to the spring of 1918. Understanding that the Americans now are coming, an unlimited supply of men from America, that it's time to push all the chips into the center of the table and go all in. And the Kaiserschlachter Operation Michael, the Germans' last major gamble, will begin. Operation Michael, led by German Quartermaster General by the name of Erich Ludendorff. This was a very simple new tactic or plan. 90 German divisions, over 3 million men, and Ludendorff's idea here of an attack, as you can see on the slide here, the area shaded where the main attack takes place, is that everything in this assault depended on initiative, boldness, flexibility, and the ability to adapt to whatever developed. You will go. This is no bite and hold British strategy. This is a go over the top and run. That the old rules no longer apply. When we blow the whistle, you just go and don't stop. You just keep going. And we will coordinate, move more troops based on colored flares. Those that are breaking through continue to fire those flares. Will funnel more troops into that breakthrough. We're going to drive a wedge right between the Allied lines and either go to the coast or go to Paris. But we're going to end this thing. And while the Germans ultimately will not be successful, their attack will bog down, and the Allies, as we'll see in part 3 ahead, are going to counterattack immediately this famed 100 days, to include heavy American involvement. One thing the Germans will learn here, speed matters. And if one can move with lightning speed, a blitzkrieg, we will be decidedly more successful in battle. So in the future, if we find ourselves at war again, we will focus on speed and mobility, and we'll let the British and the Allies bite one another and hold their ground in our prisoner of war camps. Thus, before ending the Great War here, I want to transition in part 3 to talk about American involvement, that famed 100 days that will lead to Germany's collapse, lead to Emperor Wilhelm II's abdication, the end of the German Empire. And then talk about the post-war period, this League of Nations and 14-point plan as conceived by America's President Woodrow Wilson. And also importantly, what perhaps could be viewed as the cause of World War II, the Treaty of Versailles, which is going to end the war formally with Germany. We'll go to those next in part 3. Dr. JC out here from part 2.